Hi everyone, welcome back to another video of this channel. It's Ren again and hope you're doing just as fine. Today's a bit difficult for me because I'm setting myself to do something that most of you guys will find boring, but I'm actually going to talk about pawn structure from US Chess Championship 2021. You guys may have noticed that I made a similar video about this before, and the reason I split them into both is, just to avoid one video being a bulky 20-30 minutes long. But yeah, in essence, I just find these games pretty instructive to talk about, so I just want to make room to actually make a tribute and just in general talk about things that is not very discussed. The first game in the video features a game from Alexander Lendermen and Savian Samuel from round 5 of the US Chess Championship, and as you can see, after rook takes a7 and after exchange here, we can see white is up a pawn, and most probably because the pawn is a c-pawn, accompanied by the fact that white has 2 bishops, Lendermen would actually win this. The problem is though, for you guys who watch the game, you'll notice that white takes an interesting approach to win the game and uses a whopping total of 140 moves to actually complete the game, and it wasted almost 6 to 7 hours to finish this game. For example, in this position he plays pawn to h4. Now instead of pawn to h4, why not just play pawn to c4? In this position, plays pawn to c4. It is interesting because the principle in this endgame, now that you're up a pawn closer to the center of the board, is number 1, try to push your pass pawn whenever you can. I mean, you've got to push the pawn to actually promote it to a lady right here, to a queen. And furthermore, this pawn to c4 isn't a bad move because it's protected by the bishop. So it just struck me as odd for Lendermen to actually place pawn to h4. The second principle of all in this position where you up a pawn in an endgame that is closer to the center of the board is to minimize the trade off of pawns. If anything, you want to trade off all these minor pieces off the board and push your pawns to glory. Because by trading off these nuisance minor pieces, now in turn we limit our opponent's counterplay and we make our pawn's journey a bit easier to promote. With pawn to c4, the plan is clear. After king f6, for example, we can go king to e3, and say that black moves his pieces aimlessly, we can actually just play king to d4 as well, trying to just bring our king into the game to help promote the pawn to victory. So after knight to f5 check, we can see king c5, bishop to c6, this kind of move, or should I say a sequence of moves that has a clear prospect of pushing this pawn will have actually won the game in a jiffy. It's proven that black does not have a defense to block this pawn from promoting. Let's say if he plays knight to f5 in this position, what will simply push again? There's no stopping us, and if knight to e7, let's say, we can still push the pawn, and king to d7, this will be an easy continuation to play, bishop to h4 attacking the knight, and if knight back to c8 for example, this is practically in zugzwang. We can play pawn to h3, we can play king to b8, we can play bishop to f6, bishop to e5, so next time he does knight to d6, we can just take the knight away and promote our pawn. In any case, this is a zugzwang position, and would have been an easier endgame to play for white, and somewhat a faster approach to put an end to the game. Now Lendermen is a grandmaster and plays in this elite event. He should have known about the 2 principles that we talk about, but instead plays in a fashion that accommodates black's chances to fight for a draw, and just shuffle around his pieces as you can see in this position, without even making the progress for his pawn to push forward. Okay, probably saying without progress is a bit harsh, because the king now is on the queen's side, trying to support his pawn for promotion, but still, 20 moves earlier he could have made this game easier and put an end to this game. And now as you can see, traded off the pawn that we talk about in the principle will actually diminish chances of winning and increases chances for your opponent to draw. And in this position, trade off even more pawns and place pawn to g3. So as you can see, this position becomes slightly harder for white to win, just because how centralized the king is and how active the minor pieces is to actually support and defend this c6 square for the pawn to actually promote. And so long story short, Lendermen still wins this position, but it has taken him 7 hours to complete and 140 moves on the record. If you guys are confused about the moves that he played so far, you can watch the post-game interview right here.
What is your mindset going into this kind of position? At some point we saw you shuffling back and forth and back, trying to make sure you didn't repeat. Right in the middle of that tension, what was your mindset?
Well, the key is not to make a mistake and put him under pressure. Sometimes in a position like that, when opponent has no counterplay, the Russian school method is just to shuffle pieces around, make slight improvements, and also make opponent feel like nothing is threatened, but then at some point they make an inaccuracy and then you pounce. It's a well-known strategy in such positions, but of course, I feel like if I would have found a clearer plan, then I would have played it better, but okay, I did the best I could, I guess.
I'm looking at you and
While it is true that it's actually a style of Russian chess school, and to their respect, it's one of their strongest traits in chess to not blunder anything and to gain as many points as possible, I would also like to believe that we can sign the score sheet as quickly as possible and go home to rest and or prepare for the next tournament, for the next round that is. In any case, interesting game that he played. Let me know in the comment what you think about this position and what you would have played instead. Moving on, the next game is played by Darius and Bruzon in the penultimate round of the US Chess Championship. And quickly into the opening, you can see that one is actually playing the Harwitz variation of the Queen's Gambit. The Harwitz looks like a London system, but instead of the pyramid that we see a lot in the London system, now we do see the knight on c3 and the pawn on c4. This is a more aggressive style of playing and is one of the most popular choice in the Queen's Gambit line in 2020. The main idea of this opening is that if black takes on c4 and if white takes c4, we have two bishops controlling the center of the board, one on the king's side, one on the queen's side. This should be better for white. So most of the time you'll see black ignore with knight to d7, but this is where white has chance to play pawn to c5, closing down the center of the board, also just gaining the queen side space a bit, making black's pieces a bit more difficult to breathe. Usually in this position, as the main line, you'll see black playing pawn to c6 as the way to stop this pawn from, let's say, running down the board. And also after b4, black just wants to play pawn to b6 and pawn to a5 to break down whatever white has on the queen side. Now these are all the theory. Obviously you can also play it as what Bruzon did in the game, place knight to e4, controlling the center of the board with the knight, and tries to play on the king side as well by playing pawn to f5, pawn to g5 and so on. The main principle in this kind of pawn structure is that when your opponent plays on one side of the board, in this case on the queen side, you want to counter it. Or if you think that countering is actually not an effective way, you want to actually attack on the other side of the board. In this case, if your opponent plays on the queen side, you want to attack on the king's side. If your opponent attacks on the king's side, you want to attack on the queen's side or in the middle of the board. And if he moves ahead, you see black doing that by playing pawn to f5. But now considering the last move from white, which is pawn to h4, it's probably too difficult to play pawn to g5 now. Because let's say if you play pawn to g5 right now, it will have been taken, and there's no point in giving black this kind of position where white has the open h-file and a more exposed king to actually target. So instead what must we do? We actually try to hold down whatever there is on the queen side so that your opponent won't make much of progress anyway. Pawn c6 comes to mind, pawn to b6, pawn to a5 as we talked about, and you also see Bruzon did this. But a couple of moves later, you will see Bruzon stop making his progress both on the queen side and on the king's side. Instead makes this odd rook to f7, queen to e8, queen to d8 kind of maneuver, wasting a somewhat necessary tempo on what it could use to actually hold the progress on the king's side and to try to fight back on the queen's side as well. Now white in this position plays pawn to h5, just trying to gain more space on the king's side. Bruzon plays pawn to b6, about time to actually challenge the pawn structure on the queen's side. Bruzon again could have played pawn to h6 to just stop or say hold any progress of these pawns on the king's side pushing and make something happen. Instead plays bishop to e8. I mean, what the heck is this move? It accomplishes nothing and is trying to defend nothing, not on the king's side, not on the queen's side. So I was really curious about his decision to actually cocoon on the king's side, but pawn to g4 by Darius, wasting no time. After rook to d7, doing nothing again, pawn to g5 as you can see. White puts a big cramp on black's position, and it's actually very funny because in round 2, Westiso actually did this to Darius Suyers, and now he's actually venting up his anger against someone else in this tournament. That said, Bruzon actually lost to the same structure that he actually saw in the second round. But enough talk, after bishop takes on e7 and bishop to a6 in this position, trying to take away the c8 square from the rook, black still could have played pawn to h6 in this position, trying to just, challenge the pawn structure on the king's side, and say that if white takes the pawn on h6, there will still be counterplay with king to h7, rook to g7, bishop to f7 and some sort. If you want to cocoon, you cocoon at best, right? Instead still plays an odd move like rook to b8 and allow white to actually lock the structure on the king's side. Now he's completely cramped, and I couldn't imagine him drawing this game after all. I mean, if we were to take over him in the middle of the game, we probably have won the same fashion as well. I mean, if we were to take over him in the middle of the game, I suppose we would probably win this game as well in a similar fashion, where we're just trying to take the pawn and make a pass pawn on c6. Now we have two more avenues for our major pieces to land in, and it doesn't waste Darius a second to actually use them. In this position, after rook takes b5, rook takes b7, and cb7, Bruzon resign. At the bishop takes on b5, we have rook to c8 check. This wins the queen, and if rook were to take, we take with a queen. He still can't take because he loses this queen on c8, and this is basically resignable. The last game that we can come up with in this series is probably the game between Fabiano Caruana and Alexander Lendermen in round 10. Now as you can see, it's King's Indian. After rook to c8 here, white has several options, including queen to b3 and queen to b1, both protecting the pawn on e4 with several minor pieces. Instead, he placed knight back to f3. Now, if we were to look at this position from black's perspective, there's no way that black can actually move his knight somewhere effective, right? No place on e4, knight on h5 would be odd. It's doing nothing there. Knight to e8, try to bring knight to c7, but then what? There's no way that black can bring his knight on f6 onto somewhere that is more useful. And so from black's perspective, there's one thing that black can do to actually make his pieces runs easier. And that is by playing move rook takes on c3, sacrifice in exchange. Now to be clear, as we said, white can play queen to b3. The threat is quite simple. If you play pawn to h6 right here to kick out the knight, there's a threat of knight to e6, attacking both the rook and the queen. But we can't take this because of the pawn takes. We can't move the bishop as well, because if we move the bishop, there's pawn to e7 check, and we have lost the queen and or the rook. And so rook to e8 has to be played to stop the knight from landing on e6. Fabiano Caruana in the interview admitted that after queen to b7, he had planned to play knight to c5, and that after bishop to c5 and rook to c5, at least he has two bishop pairs, and he should be happy about his position. Now instead, Lendermen plays knight to f3, removing two of his defender, which is the knight here on g5, protecting e4, and also the bishop on g2. Now cannot protect e4 anymore, and so the best thing to do to activate all his pieces is to play rook takes on c3. Ideas of the pawn takes on c3, we now have knight to e4. The knight that we thought has no future and no prospect now jumps to e4 and takes the pawn on e4. And it's not so much about the pawn, but rather after queen to c2, knight to c5. As you can see, black has multiple plans right now, all because he just sacrificed in exchange on c3. For example, he can play pawn to f5, pawn to e4 in this position. He can play queen to c7 and rook to c8. Excuse me, let's just draw that again. Queen to c7, rook to c8, just to target this weak pawn on c3, say after pawn to e4. That's very possible, all because the exchange of his rook for his knight. So for any Kings Indian players out there, if you sacrifice pieces and you can get a mobility like this is probably a worse sacrifice to do. Black now has more plans than he used to when he has not sacrificed the exchange. Now queen to c7, as we talk about, rook to a3, pawn f5, all the moves come into play. And just to be clear, there are a lot of ways to play this position. This is just obviously one of the ways that Fabiano used. But in the end of the day, as you can see, he got all his mana pieces aiming at the king side of his opponent. It's put under a spellbound where he can't do anything at the moment. None of his mana pieces is actually doing anything very active. And so in this particular moment, in this particular case, the exchange sacrifice is really worth it. Black continues with knight to b4, move that looks like a sacrifice. But the idea is after pawn takes on b4, we can take on f2. Now that the king takes, there's a checkmate with bishop to d4. The black king can't move anywhere, and so after rook to e3, we see another check, and this will have been a resounding checkmate. Say if the king does not take and he plays knight to f3, we can also just play bishop takes on g3. Black looks crushing just on every aspect on the board. And so white took on a5, but after queen takes c3, bishop to e3, he could have won easily by playing bishop takes on g3 right here, trying to exchange off the bishop this way so the queen has one way to retreat. In an interview, Fabiano stated that after bishop takes on g3, he is afraid of rook to a3, but quickly realized he could move his queen back to e5 and this would have been okay. But in the end of the day, he plays bishop to d4, and after the exchange, he thought he has pawn to f4. Now the last point to take away in this position is obviously that white cannot take the pawn here on f4, because then the queen takes on f4. The king is more exposed on the dark squares, and he moves to light squares. This does not help us wall. We always have knight to f2 check and so on. But Fabiano actually missed pawn to g4, where after this the queen has no entry, and if the knight comes to f3, this position is actually quite equal. As proven in the game, that black has some difficulty in winning the game, but in the end won it anyway. Now I believe I don't have to cover the full detail of this game. There are already YouTubers that is doing that, so I'm just going to talk about something that is very important that we can all take away in this game. And so yeah, but that's basically all the things I will talk about from the US Chess Championship. Hopefully you enjoyed the coverage though. Hopefully it's not too boring, and if you learn anything about this video and or about the US Chess Championship that is new and you enjoy it, please consider pressing that like button as a sign of support. Otherwise I'll see you very soon. Thanks for watching.